The wind howled across the wide prairie that afternoon, carrying whispers of things not yet understood. The small town of Red Fern Ridge was accustomed to secrets hidden beneath the dust, but Abigail Wyn had no idea that her life, so carefully ordered, was about to be shattered by the simplest of words. She hadn't expected much more than another quiet day teaching arithmetic to children who still believed in fairy tales. But the tall stranger at her doorstep, with his weathered hat and eyes that seemed to see through the layers of her life, had different plans. If you've ever found yourself trapped in the quiet of a small town, longing for something to wake you from your slumber, then you'll want to hear Abigail's story. Like and subscribe if you believe that life is often a series of unexpected encounters that can change everything. Because Abigail's life is about to turn on a dime, and it starts with a man whose name she barely knew. Abigail Wyn was no stranger to solitude. In fact, at 33, she had long since accepted that her role as a spinster schoolteacher in the frontier town of Red Fern Ridge was the life she would live. The days blurred together in the rhythm of school lessons, the steady scratch of chalk on the blackboard, and the silent walks back to her modest cottage, where only the wind and the occasional cattle rustler's warning would break her routine. It was a life she had settled into, not out of defeat, but out of a quiet resignation to a fate that seemed to have already been written for her. The children she taught adored her. Her students' wide-eyed wonder at each lesson was a balm to the small ache in her chest. Yet, Abigail couldn't help but look out of the schoolhouse window at the expansive prairie and wonder if there was more out there for her than the confines of Red Fern Ridge. And then, as if the wind itself had decided to test the strength of her resolve, the door of her schoolhouse swung open, and a giant of a man filled the frame. Boaz Cutter, tall as a mountain, his weather-beaten face more rugged than the harshest winds the prairie had to offer. He stood there, towering in the doorway with a hat held in his hand, as if the very act of removing it signified something far more important than anyone had the right to know. Abigail's breath caught, but she kept her posture steady, as she always did when faced with any unexpected interruption. His eyes, dark as the midnight sky over the plains, locked onto hers, and for a moment, it felt as though the world around her had paused. There was no warm greeting, no polite request, just the truth, unvarnished and blunt. "I need a wife," Boaz said, his voice a low rumble, like the distant sound of thunder before a storm breaks. Abigail stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. She'd heard of Boaz Cutter before, everyone had. He was the most successful rancher in 3 counties, known for his ability to break wild horses with a single word and his unmatched strength, but his reputation as a man who kept to himself had kept her distance. A simple man, a solitary man, not the kind to seek out a woman like her. "You need a wife?" she echoed, unsure whether to laugh or simply close the door and pretend this was all some twisted dream. His eyes softened, though the rough edge of his voice never wavered. "You need strong sons to guard your winters. Winter's coming hard this year, Miss Wyn, and it's not just the cold you need to worry about." There it was, the truth of the matter. No promises of love or courtship, just the bluntness of survival, as if life on the frontier had stripped all pretense from him. Abigail felt her heart skip in her chest, not from fear, but from something else. A tremor of realization. A possibility. She had built a life here in Red Fern Ridge, yes, but had she built the life she truly wanted? Or had she simply become resigned to it? And why, in this moment, did her pulse race at the thought of a man like Boaz Cutter, untamed, unbothered, yet in need of her just as much as she seemed to need him? Her thoughts tangled as she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, he stepped forward, the scent of earth and leather surrounding him. "I'm not asking for love," he continued, his voice quiet, as if sensing the battle inside her. "I'm stating facts. I've got a ranch to run, and you've got a life here, but we both need something more than we've got right now." In that moment, it wasn't his rugged handsomeness or the power he emanated that struck her most. It was his honesty, his raw, untamed truth, the very thing Abigail had never allowed herself to voice aloud. The harshness of the life they lived, survival over romance, was something she had resigned herself to. But what if she didn't have to? I don't understand," she managed, struggling to find her bearings. "No courtship," he clarified, taking another step closer, his imposing presence now filling the small schoolhouse. Just a practical arrangement. The world's tough out here. You know it better than anyone. We make it work, together. Abigail was subtly aware of her own smallness, standing before him. She'd spent years building a life of quiet certainty. But this man, this wild cowboy, had come to her doorstep not to offer what she expected, but to challenge her very understanding of what life could be. And though part of her wanted to shut the door and return to her carefully controlled world, another part, the part that had always wondered about the possibilities just beyond the horizon, was ready to step into something unknown. And so, in the midst of the quiet schoolhouse, surrounded by the whispers of the past and the weight of the future, Abigail Wyn made a choice. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about liking the man before her. It was about survival, and the strange, inexplicable sense that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this practical arrangement than she could ever understand. So, what would happen when Abigail agreed to the unexpected proposal of a man she barely knew? Could she tame the wild horse he spoke of? And perhaps, tame the wild heart she had locked away for far too long? Stay tuned. This is only the beginning of a story where love is built not on promises, but on trust, strength, and an unspoken understanding that sometimes the things we need most come in the most unexpected of forms. Abigail had never expected the man who would change her life to be so blunt, so pragmatic. As days passed after Boaz Cutter's unexpected proposal, she found herself torn between caution and curiosity. They had agreed. Marriage, a partnership born of necessity, nothing more. But the more she watched him in action, the more she saw the layers beneath his rough exterior. He wasn't the hardened, unfeeling cowboy the town painted him to be. There was depth in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name, and his quiet strength began to intrigue her. Boaz's wild horse, a beast of legend, became a focal point in their strange, growing connection. One evening, after a long day of cattle herding, Boaz turned to her, as if reading the unspoken question in her gaze. "You want to know if I can tame that horse," he said, his voice a low rumble, his hands never still. "You've heard the stories. But I reckon a person has to know when to fight and when to wait." Abigail nodded. She had heard the tales of the untamable stallion that no cowboy could conquer. It seemed fitting, in some strange way, that her challenge would mirror Boaz's unbreakable beast. "Then show me," she said, surprising herself. Without hesitation, Boaz agreed, but not in the way she expected. The next morning, she watched as he approached the wild horse, calm and unhurried. He spoke one word to the creature, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. The horse, once wild and unruly, calmed beneath Boaz's steady gaze. "Together," he said again, as if he were speaking to both the horse and to her. Abigail stood frozen, her heart racing. It wasn't the force of Boaz's strength that had tamed the horse, but his patience, his quiet authority. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. The wildness she'd feared in him wasn't something to be tamed. It was a part of him, just as the wild horse was a part of the land they both called home. As Boaz turned to her, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, though it was more a gesture of understanding than triumph. "It's not about breaking them," he said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "It's about finding the way through." And with those simple words, something inside Abigail shifted. The uncertainty that had plagued her heart melted into a quiet recognition. They weren't so different, she and the wild horse, both yearning for something beyond the harshness of the world around them. For the first time, Abigail wondered if this practical arrangement, this partnership born of necessity, might hold more than just survival. It might just hold the chance to find something more, something unexpected. Little did she know, the truth of those words would soon unfold in a way neither she nor Boaz could have ever predicted. As the weeks passed, Abigail and Boaz settled into a rhythm neither had expected. The practical nature of their union became a foundation for something far more profound. Their lives, though initially built on necessity, began to intertwine in ways that neither could ignore. Abigail continued to teach, pouring her heart into her students, while Boaz worked the ranch with a quiet intensity. In the evenings, after the work was done, they shared simple meals, and the conversations that followed, though brief and often about mundane matters, carried a sense of comfort that was unfamiliar yet strangely soothing. Despite the absence of romance, there were moments, small moments, that left Abigail's heart fluttering with the strangest warmth. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic, but it was there in the way Boaz's eyes softened when he spoke of his past, in the way he respected her space when she needed it, and in how he would surprise her with small gestures, like gathering wildflowers after a long day or leaving the door open just a crack when he knew she preferred the fresh air. One evening, as Abigail worked at her desk grading papers, Boaz entered the room, holding a leather-bound book. "Thought you might like this," he said, placing it on the table in front of her. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "A book?" Boaz gave her a rare, half-smile. "Ain't much of a reader, but my mother was. Thought you might appreciate it." It was a collection of poetry, Shakespeare, Tennyson, and others. Abigail's fingers brushed the cover, a warm thrill rushing through her. She had always loved literature, and for a brief moment, she felt as if Boaz had peeled back a part of his soul that few had ever seen. That night, after their quiet dinner, Boaz asked her to read to him. At first, it felt awkward, two strangers in a home that still felt too big, too foreign. But as her voice filled the room, she saw it. Boaz, not the stoic rancher, but a man who appreciated the words she spoke, the quiet beauty in the act of sharing something so personal. They spoke little after that, but the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionable. A week later, Abigail found herself standing beside him in the barn, watching him gently care for the horses. Without thinking, she reached out, brushing a strand of his hair back, a simple act that seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Boaz didn't flinch or step back. Instead, he looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, "I didn't expect this, Abigail. Any of it." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Neither did I." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than she realized. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. Somewhere along the way, they had become something more, partners in a life neither had fully anticipated, but both were beginning to embrace. As winter settled over the plains, Abigail realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. Love wasn't always about grand gestures or fiery passion. It was about respect, trust, and the quiet moments shared in the midst of hardship. It was about finding someone who, even in their silence, understood you in ways you hadn't even understood yourself. Boaz had tamed the wild horse with one word, but in doing so, he had also tamed the wildness in Abigail's heart. And though they had started this journey as mere strangers bound by practicality, they had, unknowingly, created something deeper, more enduring. In the quiet moments, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Abigail realized that what she had found with Boaz was more than a partnership. It was a home, a place where love, though unspoken, grew stronger each day. And perhaps, in time, it would become something more than they ever expected. The winds of the prairie still whispered secrets, but now, together, Abigail and Boaz Cutter were no longer merely surviving. They were living.